first year, right after the budget came out. So, anyways, we were able to close 16 out without incurring, if you will, a deficit. And the reason is, as you may recall, when you all adopted the budget last year, you assumed a very large carry-forward balance would come out of fiscal 16 from revenues, and then were programmed and part of the expenditures in fiscal 17. Well, because that money effectively did not show up, the real situation was that you had a larger shortfall in fiscal 17. So, as required by law, once the comptroller certified that the shortfall occurred, the governor was required to begin the forecasting process. We always do it in the fall, but the code requires that an immediate reforecast take place. When he briefed you all in August at the joint meeting, he revealed at that time that the cumulative shortfall, based on an updated outlook, would be about $1.5 billion. That was the 861, which included the 280, if you will, from 16, and then another 654. So it was 861 and 654. So you may recall that the governor, once he delivered that, he was now the authority was given in the Appropriation Act. You all provide him authority that once a reforecast is issued, then he has the executive authority to begin to align the spending with the new revenues. And in October, you may recall, he submitted a plan, some of which does require legislative action, some of which he could do on his own within the threshold of the 15% cap on reductions to appropriation. I will tell you, however, that everything that the governor submitted in October is all part of his amendments to House Bill 1500. So while there were certain things he could do, certain things he couldn't, he would need your approval. Everything is still before you.
Ron, if I may,
yes,
there was a question that the Vice Chairman had about a certain item that was included in the governor's recommendation.
Yeah, and so an example, again, what you all conditioned the governor's authority is that he cannot cut any program or any agency more than 15%. And whatever the 15% threshold, to the degree that the General Assembly has a specific appropriation within an agency, and in this case it was the C. Virginia first that the Vice Chairman had asked the question, the proposal in the governor's plan was a 50% reduction. And you may recall the exchange between the Vice Chairman and the Budget Director, Dan Timberlake, where Dan did acknowledge that the governor could not unilaterally reduce their appropriation by 50% for that specific case, but that he would submit it for your consideration. And so that is in the budget for your consideration. He did not do any reduction in 18, since we're talking about that. But the point being is that everything is before you. And so this was the plan. And certainly the revenue stabilization, now that those amounts have changed, and we'll touch on the new amounts when we go down the list. But at the time, this was the snapshot based on the shortfall, based on the August numbers. Okay, so let's move forward, because even though we had a update to the forecast, the law still requires a fall reforecast. So the Board of Economists, again, we got together. We waited a little longer. We did not meet until November. Typically, it's October. And likewise, the governor pushed off what we call the Gager meeting, which is the legislative leadership and business leaders, pushed it off to the end of November to try to get some more data points. Because the reality is, in the short term, at the retreat, we talked a little about this, not a whole lot has changed in the macro of the economy. And so, in fact, if you look at the revenues, which we will, in 780, the budget before you, in House Bill 1500, the only real budgetary or revenue changes the governor is proposing at this point is about $233 million, and that really is a reflection of what we call money in the bank. And here we are, this is the original forecast, Chapter 780. This was the August interim, so we went from 3.2 to 1.7. And you can see, you might recall, in November we talked a little about this, but here is our year to date. Now tomorrow, Secretary Brown will release the December numbers, and just to keep it in perspective, December, compared to a year ago, there was one fewer deposit day, okay? So we anticipated that December would be a negative month. We think it was about a negative 1.5. We'll see those numbers tomorrow, but based on our daily deposits that we get, that it appears it's somewhere about a negative 1.5, which probably puts year to date, instead of being 5.4, maybe 4%, might be a little better. Again, the daily deposits don't reflect recordation numbers and from recordation taxes. But clearly, at this point, through the first 6 months, you will be well ahead of the interim, but more importantly, well ahead of, here's the revised forecast based on the December updates. And again, really, for the most part, the December updates, adjustments really reflected the money in the bank. Now, there were some other proposals that the governor has before you all, dealing with what we'll call revenue adjustments. One, you may recall, is the accelerated sales tax. This is something that we were hoping to unwind. The threshold in 16, I believe, was at 2.5. You all would have raised it in 17 and then raised it again in 18. What the governor is recommending is that you hold it at the 2.5 in 17, and then you raise it in 18 to 4. But that would be the biennial dollars that you would be picking up, additional dollars. Because remember, I think we were still accelerating, I don't know, and what was the number? Probably 150 million or so on the ASC. Yeah, we were still accelerating really the largest of the largest dealers. So again, by lowering that threshold, you do pick up more dealers. The next big one that I'll touch on would just be, it's the Nexus rule. And this actually came from one of Virginia's business leaders who's engaged in the business of selling through the internet. It's a gentleman named Crutchfield out of Charlottesville. You may be familiar with, it's electronics and whatnot. And he deals in other states, and he, had raised the issue that you don't have to have a Nexus in Virginia, but you could be using a fulfillment center in Virginia. And so the merchandise doesn't constitute as your Nexus, because you don't have a physical presence. And he spoke because that happens in some of the other states that he's involved in. And so the administration looked at it, and so they're proposing tightening up that whole Nexus requirement, if you will, that if they're using a Virginia fulfillment center, then that is their Nexus. The next big one is the tax amnesty program, and we have not really gotten behind these numbers. We have a meeting, I believe, next Monday. I believe the chairman will be carrying that bill, but we will look at what their assumptions are. We will scrub it, and we will hopefully, maybe add a little to it, but that is our starting point. So it was about $138 million in total, and you'll see on this slide, we break out what is in the budget, what will have legislation and may be in the budget through language, and then what pieces will be legislation only. Sort of the next steps, well, we already touched on where we think December will be. We'll have Secretary Brown on Monday, but we believe we're going to be somewhere under 4% year to date, which is, again, very good. But keep in mind, January is an important month. January is important because we will have the December sales tax in January. And then, we won't see the January numbers in February, but the point being is that it reflects the sales for the holiday as well as the estimated payments that are required by January 15th. So it's a big month, and we'll just sort of see where we are at that point. In terms of what's in 1500, here's the when you take all the adjustments that he proposed, it went from $1.5 billion down to $1.2 billion. So a little better, but you still had some stuff you have to take care of. And so this is how the governor in his budget before you has proposed closing the gap. Again, the rainy day figures that we showed you earlier for 17 were considerably higher. These are now based on the revised forecast that is included in House Bill $1,500. The other one, you may recall, last year when you all approved the budget, you made a contingent appropriation. It was contingent on actually making the revenue forecast in 16. If that forecast was met, then the dollars were there to provide for a pay raise for the various public employees. Of course, because that trigger did not get pulled, that there was no authorization to release anything. And so that is part of how the gap is being closed. Now, the governor has a compensation proposal before you, but that's going to be sort of a separate action, if you will. So we'll just sort of bring you down. There's some, technical adjustments that in K-12 that freed up some resources. You'll see we're about in the middle where there are a bunch of targeted savings, higher education, which was exempt in 17. The governor has a 5% reduction in 18. That was $76 million. And then you'll see where they continued any reductions in the October savings plans. That was in 18, so for the biennium, you're picking up about 73. Again, staff will go in a little more detail, and then I'm sure as you all talk in subcommittee, you'll look at some of that. In terms of spending, the governor had about $600 million. The biggest, of course, is the Medicaid utilization inflation. Susan Masser has got slides on that. There's the compensation components, both for the state and state-supported local. And Susan will touch on this, but I just think it's worth noting, it was a discussion we had with the subcommittee chairman. For the purposes on this slide, we're saying the state share of a 1.5% bonus. When you look at the language in the budget, and Susan again will go over it, there is no requirement that school divisions actually do anything to get the money. And there is no local match. That is correct, because the money is just going out to them. Its calculation was based on if you gave a 1.5% bonus, what would the state share be for the state-funded positions? Now, you all know that the state doesn't fund 100% of all those positions. Delegate Sickles, you know that for a fact. So if the localities were to use the money for any type of compensation adjustment, they would certainly have to come up with their share of dollars to do it. But again, there is no requirement that they actually use it for a compensation adjustment. It is just flowing to them. So just wanted to make that note. So now, at this point, we're going to start off with, here she is, Ms. Massey.
Susan and Susan control all the money, is our recall, right? HHR and education.
Yeah, you like a lunchbox Joe.
Susan?
I'm just the tool.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Happy to
HHR starts on page 16, really. This is just an overview of the savings and spending in the area. The fiscal year 17 savings plans totaled were about $23 million. I'll go over those in a second. In addition, there were forecast adjustments in House Bill 1500, which is about $44 million, and other targeted savings, about $19 million. And then the spending amendments largely focus on the mandatory items as they usually do, and I'll go over those, and then other spending of about $57 million. So the savings plans are outlined on this table. This is a combination of agency reductions and balances that were taken out of agencies. I think you've seen all those, so I won't go over them. I'll go to the next page. Proposed savings of about $63 million. The largest is from the Virginia Healthcare Fund. That offsets our Medicaid general fund costs, but it doesn't get incorporated into the Medicaid forecast until you get the governor's budget, so it's a separate item. And then the rest of them are sort of listed out there in categories for you. I'm going to go through most of the important ones with you, so let's just flip on through. Mandatory spending, $355.5 million. The largest of this is the Medicaid forecast. And then you've got some changes for the children's health insurance programs, involuntary civil commitments. That's all in DMAS. The other big ticket item really is the Children's Services Act. About $13 million of that in 17 is just a shortfall that they had from 16. And then you've got two major items that are increasing pretty rapidly. The private day placements for special ed kids, which they really don't have any control over because those are made through the IEP process, and then they come to the FAP team, and the FAP team basically rubber stamps them. And then children's residential treatment services are starting to uptick again in that program, and those will be issues for this session to look at. In DSS, there's some expenditures that are largely around foster care and adoption, the forecast, and then also the feds have started kicking in match money in the 4E program for the state, what used to be state-only adoptions. So when they did that, they required us to reinvest those savings in our own child welfare activities. So you'll see reinvestment items here for some additional local staff, for some staff to deal specifically with substance-exposed infants, and some mobility software for the workers. Discretionary spendings on the next page, about $57 million. I'm just going to hit the highlights here. You saw this first item last year. The governor's proposing to pay up to 16 hours of overtime for consumer-directed personal attendance. You rejected that and did not give them the authority to do so last session. The governor's also fully funding the nursing home inflation in the second year. You did about half that amount, and then they're doing the other half this time around. In behavioral health, and I'll go through this in a minute, there's about 27.5 in items that hit the HHR area for the governor's mental health package. There's also some in DCJS that David will go through. And then the big one under DSS is the mainframe cost for the Unisys system. And really what happened last year is they got doubly cut by DPB. One section of DPB cut their costs for the Unisys mainframe, and so did another section. So this is just kind of restoring an error that was made last year but we should be fully off that Unisys system by the end of 2018. And then under Health Department, I'll just point out that there's going to be a bill coming up that would require the meningococcal vaccine prior to entering the 6th grade. Just a reminder, the next two slides are just for those folks that didn't sit in on our retreat, what the major drivers were behind the Medicaid forecast.
Susan, if you could, Delegate Sickles has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the committee met in Northern Virginia a week or so ago, a couple weeks ago, we had several people testify that there was a $10 million cut in what we used to call ID and DD waivers. Can you, where is that in here? Was that true?
No, that's not true, and I do have something on the IDDD waiver. If you'll hold that for a second, I'll come and be prepared to discuss that too.
Welcome, and for the members for the first time seeing the devices in front of you, this is our new request to speak, our new voting system. This is as we get ready to transition to the Pocahontas building. The staff's been working in the interim very hard to make sure it's going to be seamless when we go down the bottom of the hill. And so you might notice you got your picture in the bottom right, and then you got a yay nay, just like the buttons that we've had in the past. And I'm monitoring it, and it's one of those things I can actually follow like this. And Mark figured out Delegate O'Bannon, Delegate Prieston have questions.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was just making sure mine worked.
Okay, that's good, it worked. All right, Susan, please.
Okay, I just will point out on this table right here, the only thing that came down from our November presentation, whereas we actually lucked out and the feds lowered the premium increases for the Medicare program, so those numbers came down slightly. I'm not going to flip through the next one, you've already seen it, so let's just go down to slide 23, the DMAS policy changes. Medicaid expansion, the governor strikes the language prohibiting expansion. You know that is called the Stanley Amendment that's in the budget, and then adds language allowing him to expand Medicaid beginning October 1st of this year if the federal government continues their enhanced federal match for an expansion population. And then it just says if there's any savings from this, those savings would be appropriated by the next General Assembly. There are no savings assumed in the budget for this action. And then he's got language related to the consumer-directed personal care attendants. So just remember that was $8.5 million. Language authorizes it. And then on the next page is I'm going to the waiver changes. What he's doing in the act here, remember you just had your ID and DD and day support waiver redesigned. So it's not based on the disability type. It's now based on the need for services. So you've got the community living, which was your former ID waiver, but it's got some enhanced services, and that's gonna be your residential component. And then you've got family and individual supports. There's enhanced services there to better meet the needs of the individual. And then the building independence, that's a lower level to keep folks, that don't need quite as many services, but are more tailored again to meet the needs. There's no distinction on disability. Waivers are supposed to meet the needs of the individuals as they present and are assessed. So Chapter 780 had 440 required waivers required by DOJ in 18. And what House Bill 1500 does, it reallocates the slots in the waiver based on what the agencies believe is the expected utilization in those waivers. And you see the table there and the reallocation. As part of this reallocation, you'll see that the decrease in the community living waivers and the increase in the family and individual support waivers there's a change in the mix there, so that sort of changes the funding level, Delegate Sickles, that you'd asked about. The governor did not take any money out of the budget for this. All the money that you put in for the waiver services are there. So he did have some language to allow him to approve more slots if they can demonstrate that the reallocation spending is lower than what you have in there in the budget for it, okay? So the money's there, nobody's taking it away. It's not the number that you heard the advocates talk about at the public hearings. It's not, it's less than that, okay?
Susan, for our conversation yesterday with the subcommittee chairs, there will be, HHR sub will be looking at that language and tweaking it to make sure that, that they've got to have the real savings to be able to add any additional waivers if there are truly savings at the end of the day.
Next page is the governor's mental health package. In HHR, this is in a couple places. It's in the behavioral health, it's in the secretary's office, and it's also in Medicaid. The largest one is $8.2 million and some non-general fund Medicaid match for the community service boards to implement same-day access to services. They'd get their intake, they'd get assessment, and they would get services probably within about 10 days if they needed them right away. There's $5 million for opioid treatment services, and I've shown you right there how many people they think that they can serve. $3 million for the local inpatient services. That's just buying acute care beds in the community to save costs at the state facilities, particularly for your TDO population. $2.5 million for discharge assistance. That's to get some of these individuals that are hard to get out of the state facilities but are ready for discharge and get them back into the community. You've got detox in there. You've got some community geropsych teams to work with getting folks out of our geriatric facilities because they are also seeing increases in TDOs to those facilities. And then some for the opiate overdose kits. Yeah. Next slide, you've got $2.1 million for needs at the state mental health hospitals. They've just been overrun with that last resort legislation, so they need some additional staffing and some additional money for pharmacy. And then the $4.5 million at the Office of the Secretary of Health and Human Resources is to pay for a behavioral health system assessment and analysis. And as I understand it, the Secretary and the Commissioner will probably be addressing this as well later on. The funds would be used to hire an expert that would basically conduct a statewide assessment, really getting the community service boards ready to transform their system into this new business model, if you will, where you take people in right away, you get them assessed, you determine their services, you get them, try and avert crises. And then part of that would be money to study the agency itself to make sure that it's well configured to support this new business model that they're proposing. And they term it the STEP Virginia model. Some of you may have heard that. Lastly, the TANF block grant. I said the good news is that less people are relying on TANF services and benefits, so the cash assistance is coming down. And then what it's doing is we've got a bigger balance in TANF. It's going to be almost $72 million by the end of fiscal year 18, so that's something the subcommittee will want to take a look at. And as part of the agency savings plans, they're proposing to swap out funding for about 3 programs and use TANF for that instead. So that's pretty much it for HHR.
Any questions of Susan or Michael? Michael, good afternoon.
meeting, Mr. Chairman.
New you too, sir. Sorry about your Vikings this year.
Yeah, I'm used to it.
Every,
Starting on slide 29, compensation retirement. The amendments reflect the removal of the payroll reserve fund, which was contingent on the 2016 revenues meeting the forecast. That just removed the $346 million in appropriations, which would have been used for across-the-board and targeted salary increases beginning in FY 2017. On slide 30, there is $56 million in the budget for a 1.5% bonus. This is 1.5% of the annual salary, which would be effective on December 1st. It's $42.2 million for state employees, including college and faculty and higher ed personnel, and $13.8 million for state-supported local employees, both on December 1st. In addition, the introduced amendments restore funding for amendments for targeted salary increases that were originally planned for 2017, which would take place now in 2018 at the beginning of the year. There's $8.7 million for depression adjustment for deputy sheriffs. There's $3.9 million in funding for career development programs, which is slightly more than what was in last year's budget in 2018. It was $3.5 million. More people have qualified for the program, so therefore the number has increased. There's also $4 million for the state police and $2.5 million for district court clerks. Other funding actions in compensation retirement include $181,000 each year based on an increased projection in the number of people, premiums that would pay for line of duty employees based on the increase in the estimated number of people who would be potentially eligible for benefits. There's also some savings in the second year from lower worker compensation premiums. In addition to that, there's $4 million in the budget, $1 million in the first year and $3 million in the second year, based on two proposed federal regulations that are being developed. One is the new overtime regulations, which are currently on hold due to litigation and being opposed by the incoming administration. So whether or not this cost will come to fruition is still up in the air. In addition to that, there is some funding for, basically there is a federal regulation being developed that would require background checks on any state employee who has access to federal tax information. Moving on to general government. First two slides show some significant saving amendments in general government. There's $2.6 million over the biennium in savings for the Department of General Services, which is consistent. Over half of that savings in the second year is related to proposals to basically swap out employees from general fund employees to non-general fund revenue sources. In addition to that, in the Department of Human Resources Management, there's $1.8 million in general fund savings from converting the new personnel management information system from a general fund system to a system that's funded with internal service funds. The cost for the other agencies to reimburse them would be $900,000 GF, so the net savings is about $900,000 GF. Slide 35 shows savings from the Department of Taxation, which was $2.5 million in the first year, which was all part of the governor's October plan, and the savings is carried forward is about $1.3 million in the second year. On spending, the main spending items in general government, the largest one.
Delegate McQuinn has a question. Okay, that's fine. You just want to see if I was paying attention, didn't you? Okay.
The largest spending amendments in general government is in the Department of Elections. They're going to exhaust their federal HAVA fundings at near the end of FY 2018, and the budget includes $2.3 million to backfill for the loss of that funding. In FY 2019, the need will be substantially greater because they will have to backfill all of the entire year funding. There's also $1.2 million for enhancements to the VERIS system. In addition to that, the other spending amendments that are significant there's $2.2 million in central appropriations to cover the cost of the inauguration and transition next year. There's also $1.2 million for an internship and training program within state government, which would allow new college graduates to come in and sort of work and get trained in different areas of the state. They would work some as legislative staff, DPB, sort of across state government. Lastly, there's a language amendment which authorizes the Department of Accounts to get $52 million in the working capital advance for the development of the new payroll system.
Michael, if I can, I remember a couple of years ago, for those on JLAR, we had a report with the Cardinal Financial System for cars, I believe. Was this, I thought, Doc, you can help me here, they had program cost to cover that. Is this additional unexpected potentially, or is additional module? Just trying to figure out where this 10 million might be coming, the need might be coming from potentially.
It's the original contract for Cardinal did not cover the payroll system. Now, they determined later that they need a new payroll system because, again, it is antiquated and based on COBOL or C++, one of those two. So this is, the new payroll system will be the same system as Cardinal, the same technology, but it's a different module.
So you got 52 plus you got 10 million of that 52, or is it 10 on top of it?
It's 10 of the 50, 10 of the 50.
Thank you very much. Susie Teacher. Good afternoon, how are you, Susie? Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, thanks so much. All right, we're gonna start out, just a couple of observations for, public education. Big picture, Department of Education and Direct Aid didn't realize any of the, budget reductions that were imposed at 5% and the 7.5% decreases that other agencies did, right off the top. Major, proposed amendments reflect either, routine technical updates for average daily membership, or program participation, and then changes to the sales tax revenue forecast. The other amendments also use of additional non-general fund revenues from either the lottery and or literary funds that offset, internal offset, a like amount of general fund savings and revenues. But just as a side note, the school divisions on those fund swaps won't realize any budget reductions at all in their distributions. So, turning on then to the technical updates that start on page 41, amendments reflect the removal of that $135 million, and that was in contingent appropriations. That was predicated, as you all know, on the FY16 revenues meeting the forecast, which would have then triggered the salary adjustment in 17 that Robert had already mentioned that earlier in the presentation. There's $34 million in savings from the annual updates, as I mentioned a minute ago, from student membership projections over the biennium due to slower student growth over the 2 years. And I've listed out there for you what those savings are by year, and then the fewer students. Overall, we're growing about 0.2%, so almost relatively flat on a 1.2 million student enrollment basis. There at the bottom, in addition, there's about $7.1 million in savings that picked up from either lower participation in remedial summer school, ESL, incentive, and categorical account programs. Turning then to the sales tax related updates, their proposed actions reflect those 3 sales tax forecast updates with changes, in addition to changes to the actual sales tax distributions based on the updated school age population from census from Morgan Cooper's, and then those net actions altogether, we pick up a savings of just over $38 million over the biennium. Table at the bottom of that slide 42 shows you sort of the mechanics behind the actual sales tax when it comes in. There's the revised sales tax forecast, which you see right there is about $91 million savings over the biennium. We then have to backfill our share of SOQ adjustments, which costs us the $51 million, which nets us down then in total to the $40 million savings. Moving on, technical updates related to there's lottery revenues and lottery funded program accounts. Collectively, there's lottery changes, about just under $52 million over the biennium in the first year rather, and about $5.5 million in the second year. And just for the brevity of the presentation, I won't go over the details there. And then just to finish up, those lottery dollars we use to offset like amount general fund savings. All right. Other proposed technical updates done on slide 44. There's a use of $25 million each year of literary funds that we will use for teacher retirement costs over each year in the biennium. There's an update to National Board Certification, bonus payments, which reflects a savings of 1.7 over the biennium. And then lastly, there's about $1 million savings because we have fewer students in the governor's school enrollment, and in turn lower add-ons for the workforce costs. Moving on, Robert mentioned earlier in his part of the presentation, there's $55 million in the second year. That's based on the state's share of an equivalent 1.5% bonus. That's based on the SOQ funded instructional and support positions, along with those same type of positions under the governor's academic school year program as well. It does not reflect any requirement. The language has no requirements for any certifications at all to verify that if the funds were to be accepted, that the school employees would receive any raise at all. They could just use the money for whatever they wanted to. So I just wanted to make that crystal clear for you guys. And as Robert said also, if they did choose to use our $55 million for and to provide a 1.5% equivalent, they really do have to come up with their share, because otherwise it's only a portion of the whole pie, and the employees would get something considerably less.
And Susan, if I may, I believe all 12, the jurisdictions gave some form of compensation adjustment.
You are exactly right.
In spite of the fact it was contingent language, they proceeded to do on their own with full understanding that there would be no money there. We would have taken action that, we would know we had some issues. We knew in May that we had issues.
That would have been in plenty of time for many of those localities to rescind what would have been at that point going to their local boards for
Correct.
approval. So you're
And
exactly
we have
right.
always implemented SOQ positions. And so this would be something that's unprecedented in many regards as far as not requiring any local match exception.
For the pay raise, you're exactly right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes.
And we did reinstate the lottery dollars as well, which was significant.
Second year for lottery on a per pupil basis, it's $157 million, which is just about $225 per student, and up to half of it can be used for non-recurring expenses that could,
So this is additional money. I believe you started your presentation with the fact they were held harmless. They didn't have any cuts to K-12. I just want to make sure we have a good understanding of our point of departure. We talked about various areas of our budget that we're going to be contemplating with the next handful of weeks.
and there's routine technical updates because of changes, you don't have the students, you don't get the money.
Correct. And that's what the ADM deals with.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, so let me just wrap up right quick then. There's $1 million, second year teacher residency program. Language accompanies that also, that says, gee whiz, America, you don't have, if you have unobligated balances, you can also put that towards the teacher residency program as well. $480,000 the second year for a summer cyber camp. The Eliminate the Math Science Teacher Recruitment Initiative, that's a pickup of $400,000 each year. The new Teacher Improvement Compensation Initiative has been cut back in the second year with $2 million has been budgeted. And then skipping on then to central office, let's finish up with that right quick. The most significant one, slide right, there you go.
Would you mind signing the slides? I'll just come out and ask a question.
Susan, give us a little information on the summer cyber camps, what we've learned about them, what reporting requirements were given us.
Thank you very much for the question. 32 camps, 38 school divisions participated. They were launched over the course of the summer. State's memo went out back in December, as I recall, and then throughout the spring. They actually carved out and used $2 million out of the $7+ million in the extended year-round school monies that have been in the budget. Department of Education felt that they have the authority based on the language in the budget that says if there's some innovative school approach, they could in fact then use a portion of those dollars, which they did. There have been the evaluation metrics for the 12 school divisions completed sent complete matrix in terms of student attendance, teacher attendance. They didn't have, and the SOL reading and math scores, majority of them did have some marginal pickups, but not a great deal. long and short of it, more of them did not send in evaluation matrix data, so I can't tell you and can't answer the question as to, how actually useful it has been, but they're looking for an additional $480,000 next year, yeah. Central office, transfer of $57 million in federal funds and 20 positions from Department of Health over to DOE so that they can handle the administrative duties that are associated with the federal summer food service program along with the adult and child care food service program. There's $1.6 million and to cover increased costs for a statewide rollout of the instructional improvement system for all school divisions to tap into. There's $400,000 to cover costs for algebra readiness diagnostic test, and another $500,000 in the second year to cover student growth model pilot that we started this current year. The last slide really is just those technical, the October savings plans that was in the governor's budget, and they're there for your reference. Questions?
Questions? Anyone on the committee?
Thank you.
Sure, there'll be many as the session moves on, though. Tony, good afternoon.
Chairman, good afternoon. In the area of higher education, major items, there's about $76 million of reductions in the second year related to the 5% across the board against the public colleges and universities. It includes VIMS and extension in part of extension tech to get about a 3% reduction. Norfolk State and Virginia State were exempt, as was the issue extension. There's also about $40 million for the recovery of the non-general fund share of the acceleration of the VRS repayment. The dollars were taken as general fund, even though this is the non-general fund share of it, and it was taken $24 million the first year and $16 in the second. Again, teaching hospitals, VIMS, and extension were exempt from the recovery. The research initiative from last year was, there's about a 50% reduction in the first year, about $8 million, and about 43% or $6 million in the second. And that includes the Innova money that was put out there as well. And then lastly, there was $4 million each year for the interest earnings at the colleges in Central Approach, and that was eliminated in total. In other reductions in higher education, the other entities, EVMS, Jeff Labs, the higher education centers, received about a 5% reduction in each year, except for EVMS, which was exempt like the colleges in the first year, and that generated about $800,000 the first year and $1.8 million in the second. Chev got reductions of about 4% the first year and 5% the second. Financial aid programs like TAG and things like that were exempt, as was the online degree program. State libraries and museums in general received about a 5% the first year and a 7.5% the second. Jamestown, the 2019, though, was hit with 10% the first year, about 80% reduction in the second year is what's proposed. In terms of spending, there were 3 spending items. There's about $1 million. You approved last year that the workforce credential program. You put $4 million in the first year and $8.5 million in the second. The way that the money was being spent, there's an additional $1 million being proposed for the demand in the first year. Both the BCCS and Chev sought the increase based on the current demand. However, there's no data just yet to determine whether what's being done aligns and has the results in the various regions with the credentials being produced. The
Vice Chairman has a question.
Related to that, so we basically don't know whether they've met the criteria based on whether the credential is applying to and actually they're becoming employed in whatever their credential is, a skill level set, whatever, it could be manufacturing or whatever. So we have no data to really show. And wasn't that the understanding, is that they were going to receive the funds, but then it was going to translate into jobs and the person is employed, because that was one of the triggers, wasn't it, for the reimbursement?
So, Mr. Chairman, Delegate Landis, yes, sir. What's happened so far, as I understand, is this: the Workforce Council has identified high demand fields. The State Board of Community Colleges has said these are programs that align with those fields that you've identified. The way that the money was going to, that has to roll out is part of the money goes out for getting, for the student going in. The incentives that are in there is the student has to complete, otherwise there's one piece. The student then has to, when they have to get the credential, and that kicks in, that's the other piece of this. If you will, then the proof in the pudding at that point then becomes, so they have the credential, they have everything, did it actually result in employment? And the classic example is, I have a welding A license and I needed a welding C. And so, someone having to go back and, their skill set is not aligned with what the demands are from the private sector. And that's those parts at this point, we just don't have the data at this point to see if everything is meshing together.
And follow up on Steve's question, I had some conversations with some different individuals, and I think what we're seeing is you have programs that have been out there. They've been subscribed X per year. So now what's happening, those who have now enrolled, it's not that you're creating any new additional certifications necessarily. They're just being able to have it paid for by the state because they're going into already identified high demand fields. I think what we need to really look at is how many additional certifications are being created above and beyond what was being created. Because my conversation last night with someone was, that programs have like 15 a year in this program. Now what's happening, you go, wow, now all can go without having to pay but X to do what they were already accomplishing in that region. So I'm not sure we'll get any additional certifications out of this, but that's some tweak to the language. No wonder there's no additional monies, because if we're going to be paying for it, and there are any programs in place, you would think this would be the behavior.
We also want to make sure that we're getting those credentials in the areas where there's demand for the particular positions, that particular job.
And participation by the industries
Yes.
that are benefiting potentially from that. So there's a little more probably work that needs to be done before any additional dollars would go out the door, I would think.
Yes, sir.
Steve's question. Sickles?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to follow up with what you said. Are we trying with this money to implement the most recent, sorry, someone's calling, with the most recent bill that we passed last year in workforce development? So this is kind of a transition to a new program that we gotta make sure goes well. That's what's happening here, right?
That is correct, and the
Okay.
quick uptake is, without really any, the theory behind it was you would have these regions that would go in and find where they have 3 to 5 areas of high demand that they're unable to fill those jobs because they have the individuals with the right certification to be able to do it. And so it's going to be curious to the overlay, have you actually created and filled voids that exist, not necessarily just allow those who are currently demand being met, that is now being paid for by us. And I think that's a big difference. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's just my thought.
The other two spending items, Mr. Chairman, is $700,000 for growth in the transfer grant program, and that's primarily occurring at George Mason. And then lastly, there's about $900,000 in VMI to backfill for projected revenue loss on the tuition for out-of-state students who entered the Virginia National Guard, and they would receive in-state tuition. The assumption here is that there'll be legislation. Looking at the numbers, this would cover about 37 students. There's about 40 cadets that theoretically are eligible, and there's 660 out-of-state cadets who may also be eligible. And there's no provision at this point for anyone in the Tech Corps cadets or anywhere else across the Commonwealth. So there's still some questions about this program.
Dr. Lingenfelter.
Mr. Chairman, I believe you and I have talked about this in the past, and as far as a policy is concerned, I don't believe that we have warmly embraced this idea in the past. Would that be correct?
That is correct.
Thank you, sir.
And I do believe that there are many other benefits that are received by these individuals in the Corps that are in the Guard, correct?
I'd have to check on that, Mr. Chairman.
I do believe in that, and they've come from other states that have come into and are part of the Guard in that regard.
huge amount of money, but in the environment we're in, everything's a huge amount of money. But the question I think that we have to resolve, and Tony, I can get with you on this, is the underlying policy. Is this really a pathway we want to go? I know the intent is well, everybody's got great intentions, but as policy, and Mr. Chairman, you've cautioned us about this, about how we vector ourselves to sort of ever perpetual issues that come with some of these ideas year after year after year. And so I would just be very concerned about how wide this door may wind up being opened.
And I've met with the adjunct and made it clear to him my position that I didn't think it was a good public policy for us to pursue.
Moving on to capital outlay. The first part is that capital outlay was used to help balance the budget. There's about $142 million of savings. The largest one is about $95 million in general funds that were supplanted with Virginia College Building Authority bonds. These were projects that were previously authorized in the 2015 session. But there's about another $34 million in balances from either the central capital planning pool or project balances themselves, $14 million from the planning pool. That's about half the funds in the pool, and about another $19.5 million that actually was supplanted in 2015, but the funds were never reverted, so the dollars were still sitting out there. And lastly, there's another almost $14 million from the Treasury Board due to refinancing of several of the bond issuances that were already out there. Other items in capital, there's new tax-supported debt of about $176 million that's proposed. There are project pool supplements of about $21 million for 6 projects that were previously approved and they need to be supplemented. There's about $105 million for the new proposed ABC central office and warehouse facility, with some language about the sale of the property, their current property at market value and allowance for them to go forward with a PPEA. There's about $30 million for 6 new projects. Several of these projects were contemplated last year during your bond program, Mr. Chairman. They were not moved forward, so that's something that you may want to take a look at. About $20 million for the equipment for projects coming online, and then $1 million at the military affairs for additional maintenance reserve. Other capital outlay, there are several non-general fund projects you can see listed there, most of them in higher education. There are projects that are funded through revenue bonds. These are dorm projects, things like that, as well as the non-general fund share for some of the general fund projects. Then there are additions. There are 4 projects that were added to the planning pool. There's a training center for the state police. There's the Watson Theater at Woodrow Wilson Rehab Center, and then 2 of the projects, Central State Hospital and repairs to Monroe, again, which were both considered last year and again not moved forward. It's unclear whether these projects would jump ahead of the projects that you included in your legislation last year. Finally, in language, there's some language that lets the state police use some of their balances from the STARS radio system to upgrade current equipment. Some language to help manage some of the projects that were in the bond program last year for the secretary. Putting solar panels and projects on land that's owned by forestry, DOC, and DJJ. There's some changing of some project titles to utilize unused 9C bond proceeds as opposed to creating a new project, and then the sale of some property with VDOT related to the Hampton Roads headquarters.
Tony, Delegate Greason has a question, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tony, back on the ABC $105 million, has that gone through our normal process of going through the step of planning money first and then coming into maybe a much larger project like that?
They've done a study where they've identified, in general, here's the project would be located on land and a building of such and such size, and there are estimates. But as an example, the property itself, one question might be locating it on current state property, which would save us X million dollars, so we would not necessarily have to acquire land since we already own land. There's the sale of the existing facility. How does that play into the overall needs of the project itself? There's the notion of how the project might move forward. As right now, it would move forward as tax-supported debt, other options that might be contemplated, that, would allow us. So there are a lot of other questions, and perhaps, maybe some refining of the estimates, but typically what we would do is we would provide for the authority to move forward to preliminary drawings, and then when they get done with that, they come back with a really tight estimate, address some of the other concerns, and then you can move forward with the funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Ready? Dave, good afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to public safety, slide 59. This table is showing the savings actions and the governor's October reductions. There were a total of about $20.4 million in savings actions in public safety agencies. As you can see, the bulk of the savings actions were in state, DOC, about $15.5 million, coming from delaying opening the Culpeper Women's Correctional Center, deferring some equipment replacement, and from staff vacancy savings. There were $1.3 million in reductions from state police, coming from the elimination of the funding positions for their special ops division, as well as the funding of positions for the New River Valley. And DCJS delayed the awarding of grants for local pretrial and community corrections programs. Slide 60 shows that there are also about $12 million in non-general fund balance transfers from public safety agencies. There was a $1.2 million supplant in DOC coming from balances in correctional enterprises and other sources. And there was about $400,000 in balance transfers to the general fund. State police had $5.6 million in balance general fund supplants coming from the funds listed here. And DCJS, the big item, was a $4.4 million transfer in balances from the asset forfeiture proceeds to the general fund. Slide 61. Department of Corrections. For 18, the introduced budget includes $22 million in savings for the agencies, primarily coming from continuing to delay the Culpeper facility. There's an additional $18.6 million included for increased inmate medical care. $300,000 for the Woodrum impact of administration bills. And finally, $200,000 in 2 positions to assist the Board of Corrections in performing investigations of deaths in local and regional jails. State Police, the Special Operations Division and New River Valley Area Office reductions were continued into 2018. There's $5.9 million in 16 positions in the second year to support State Police's transition from VITA, and this would be an amount in addition to the $7.6 million already in the department's base budget for IT services. However, going forward, something we'll have to look at are the $3.6 million in stranded costs that will continue to be paid even after State Police is no longer part of the Northrop Grumman contract. And there's $500,000 in 7 positions for related to administration legislation on universal background checks for firearm purchases. An additional $500,000 in 6 positions for background checks related to child care providers and the existing firearms transaction program. ABC, the big item here is obviously the increase in net profit transfers. The department's continued to see strong growth, and so the profit transfer has been increased by $13 million in fiscal 17 and just under $12 million in fiscal 18. Other public safety agencies in DCJS, there's a $1.7 million reduction in the general fund amounts available for local victim witness programs. I'll be talking to the department about this action in more detail tomorrow, but it appears there may be some federal funds to offset this as well. That's part of the thinking here. There's a $500,000 reduction in the second year for local pretrial and community corrections programs. The big item in DCJS is $4.2 million and two positions for grants to local and regional jails for mental health screening and assessment. I just wanted to point out that this is in addition to the $3.5 million that was provided last session for 6 pilot programs. That has just gotten underway as of this past January 1st. And so we will be working through to see how this item fits into the larger mental health package, as well as how it relates to the pilot programs that we funded this past session. And finally, there's a $500,000 in the department to develop new training standards and curricula for community policing. Moving on to the veterans, the first year they captured some savings from the B3 program. They don't think the demand for grants is going to be what was provided for the first year. There's also a reduction in the second year by delaying hiring a administrator for the Veterans Care Center. The center won't open until 19, so the staff won't be necessary until then. There's $600,000 and 34 positions to fully implement the reorganization of the VBFS, or what was formerly known as the Wounded Warrior Program. This is coming out of a working group that reported this past JLARC, and is the option that they presented that fully funds the transition. Finally, there's $900,000 that the second year to establish a new grant program to support veteran entrepreneurship, and this would be authorized by an administration.
David, if I could, in that regard, any detail or specificity to the $1 million ask?
I will be talking to Ms. Frazier tomorrow. Apparently this bill was handled through the Secretary's office. I did finally see the language of the bill this morning. It looks like it would be a special non-reverting fund that would give grants to organizations that educate and train budding entrepreneurs who happen to be veterans as well. But certainly we'll be looking for more detail on what the proposal entails going forward. Yeah. Finally, for the judicial department, there's $2.5 million in the second year for a compensation initiative for district court clerks and deputy clerks, and also a $300,000 transfer from the criminal fund to cover increased costs of the involuntary mental commitment.
Any questions for David?
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next we have Skip. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Welcome. Good having you on board full time, and
Thank you, sir.
looking forward to working with you.
Commerce, Trade, and Technology. I start with Commerce and Trade. There's a number of amendments that have been proposed, most of which decrease spending for the department, but there are a few new spending items to give us a net decrease of 21.9 for FY17 and just under 15 for FY18. Sorry, it's only my second time to do it.
We have women here that can certainly help you, and they will be glad to instruct you in what you need to be doing.
Housing and community development. There's a reduction in the enterprise zone grants for the localities, the ones the localities use, by 1.8 million over the biennium, and the funding both years 600,000 and 325,797 for the integrated test facility has been eliminated. The likelihood of the federal matching funds coming for that program have pretty much evaporated. So the biggest thing for housing is the Go Virginia cuts. First year, funding reduced from 5.5 million to 900,000, and second year 30 million to just under 20 million. Broken out the cuts to the individual parts here, and you can see it leaves about 100,000 per region for the 9 regions for Go Virginia for the planning purposes the first year, and then in the second year, the larger hit goes to the per capita regional grant funding, which is cut, essentially cut in half, and then the competitive grants are reduced by 2 million. Slide 70, Department of Mines and Minerals and Energy. New spending of just over $1 million in general funds for a new solar energy program. One of them is a credit enhancement program. Essentially ensures private sector financial institutions providing loans. They hope to leverage this $750,000 into $4 million, and then the $350,000 is a competitive loan fund, and they hope to leverage significant money out of that. The minimum for that is a 50% match to qualify. EEP, we've got several reductions here and some other things. Brownfields Restoration Economic Development, they reduced those funds both years. Next two are both similar in that they used federal funds to supplant the general fund dollars that had been allocated there. This was mentioned in the October presentations that we heard from Finance. But they both have taken a reduction in the second year, the GGDI by 75,000 and then the STEP program by 25. And then there is some new spending, 168,000 in the second year for an internal auditor, which is the first step, I guess, of the governor's EDP reform package. Slide 71. Incentive payments, we have a total of 125.4 for the biennium. There is a slight increase, but it's mostly driven by this first bullet, the shipbuilding production facility grant. This is the first payment on a several payment schedule of $6 million for the second year. And the second one is the final payment on the training facility grant program that we were engaged in. And that's the last 7.2 million general funds that we have to pay on that. 72, the Rolls-Royce incentive payments. This one you see a reduction of 8.5 million in the first year and 3.7 in the second year. And they've moved the bulk of the payments for this off to the second year, totaling 15.2, because of an adjustment in the schedule of them being the performance measurements of the agreement, and they have captured previously appropriated money from those 3 accounts there, the 2.5 from engine manufacturing supplier clutch grant, 11 million from the manufacturing performance grant, and the 1.2 million from the manufacturer's workforce training grant to provide the bulk of the funding for that second year outlay. VDIG is essentially similar in that they utilized previously appropriated funds and reappropriated them, if you will, to displace some other funds, providing for reductions for these on revised payment schedules from these agreements. They total 2.8 reduction in FY18, and then the 5.2 is the total going to be laid out for second year. This slide has to do with the International Trade Corporation, which was expected to be created in April. They took action in the budget in anticipation of that. This transfers the 6.2 million already allocated to VDP's international trade activities to the second year to support the creation of this new corporation. They also transfer 150,000 general funds for 1 position from the Secretary's office. And then lastly, we have just over 800,000 in new spending for 5 new positions to handle the administrative functions of this new organization. Tourism, this is a combination of several programs. aggregate with regard to marketing, advertising, and sponsorships. It aggregates to a total of just over $700,000 reduction first year and $1.5 million second year. This next one is the one that Robert referred to earlier in his opening remarks about the 50% reduction. We saw this in the October savings plan. So this is the one that exceeds the mandate in the budget language, so it would have to be approved by you all. And then lastly, we have a new funding of a multi-year initiative, $400,000 for the second year to promote travel from India to Virginia. Labor and industry, I looked into this a little bit more since our conversation yesterday. This provides for $1.5 million new general fund funding second year for 15 new positions. You can see they're outlined here. I put a request in for some information, and it's been coming in today. It's still coming in while I was sitting over here. I was reading some of it, so I'll have a more detailed picture of this particular thing, hopefully by the end of the day. Lastly, technology. We have some savings that have been found in CIT. They utilized some unappropriated or unallocated funds from two programs up there, plus found some cost savings, administrative cost savings from their October plan. And then there is some language that is intended to tighten up the way they spend the money for the various programs listed here that they have up at CIT. Governor's intention is apparent. He's trying to cut down on the program costs being used for administrative overhead. And at VITA, they continue their transition activities. They have a couple of places where they have some savings that are associated with that. This one in particular is 3.4 in first year and 3.5 second year, and they have a significant FTE reduction. They do have two new spending items, both of which are one-time. One of them pays off an old debt that goes back to when I was here previously, the Secretary of Technology's office on the old Virginia Enterprise Application Architecture, whatever that was. The program that funded that line of credit has been eliminated, so there's this outstanding debt that's been there for several years, and they're just getting rid of it. The other one, they're transitioning some general fund costs that they have now into non-general funds and making adjustments to the ISF in order to accommodate those beginning in FY19. The changes go into effect in FY18.
Legacy.
Well, first of all, congratulations on Clemson's national championship.
Absolutely, sir.
And I wanted to ask you about the first year of the Go Virginia cuts were pretty steep. And was that because it was just hard to get the program going? I mean, that was a pretty big cut. I mean, the business community that I'm familiar with is concerned about these cuts, and I just wondered if the cut was because of the startup issues.
That was a significant part of it, from what I understand. It's slow going, getting started.
I would add, I don't believe it was to the extent of the nature of the cut, though.
Can't speak to that, Mr. Chairman. You have to ask the governor.
Delegate Point, are you done, Dr. Sickles? Okay. Delegate Point Extra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Skip, back on chart 68, the grant, Natural Disaster Resilience Competitive Grant, where we asked to, we're proposing putting up $15 million in state match for $120 million federal grant. Is that a one-year deal or multi-year deal?
Well, from what I understand from this one, I looked into this one a little bit more since our conversation yesterday. It's non-general funds, a federal program, and Virginia's received this bulk, and this portion of it, essentially they're going to act as the, they're just going to dispense the money. It's basically the city of Norfolk is going to contract with various groups to do some engineering and site visits and just analyze several ways in which they can prevent significant damage from the recurring flooding. I mean, I've read holding tanks for water and
whatever the type of water.
Right, but and then the city is just going to submit the invoices to the state to then pay.
Understand, but I didn't ask my question clearly, I guess. Are we only gonna be on the hook for 15 million in 19, or 20 million in 21, or is this a one-year deal?
I can't answer that yet, sir.
Okay, that's fair, that's fair. Do you know which federal agency it is? That gave us the grant?
I don't, like I said, I'm still looking into it, that's what I've got so far.
I think the better way to ask the question is, are they gonna use any of these funds for ongoing operational expenses that might be requested of us in the future?
I will ask, sir.
Mr. Chairman,
This is Douglas Dolly.
just for clarification, that 15 million comes from the 120 million of federal grant. That's not state money, it's all flowing through us, but it's not expenditure of state money for this.
That's correct, that's my understanding.
Right, and I just know from my days on city council and days up here that when federal grant good out, hollow dollars are running out, we've got to backfill, however many, $2 or $3 million. We need to come up with a whole lot more in 18, or whatever, maybe 19 for the hollow backfill. So while it's not our money right now that we're spending in the general fund, Virginia taxpayer money at the state level, it is federal money. It could be expected for us to backfill if a program is dependent upon that to operate.
Understood, I'll ask.
Any other questions? If not, Ann, you are clean up.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Moving next to slide 77, there in agriculture and forestry. Overall, within the Secretariat, we saw cuts of $1.6 million in the first year, just under 3%, and $3.6 million in the second year, just over 6%. Starting with the Department of Forestry, they do include the establishment of a new fee to try to help offset some of their general fund reductions. This would be a $100 per job site fee to loggers for the enforcement of silvicultural water quality inspections. Currently, the department undertakes that at no cost to the logging operators. There's also a reduction of $300,000 in the second year to the general fund match for the reforestation of timberlands program. You might recall that FY18 would have been the first year that y'all have been matching that one-to-one in a couple of decades now. They also generated savings of just over $300,000 in the second year by eliminating 4 positions, all of which will result in layoffs at the department, and further captured some turnover and vacancy savings and eliminated a new position that was authorized this past session that was not filled. Finally, there's language authorizing the sale of 5 forestry tracts. You see where they're located across the state, and those revenues assumed to be about $340,000 would be retained by the department instead of going to the general fund.
Delegate East has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on that last point, is that land to be transferred encumbered with an easement? Is there any assurance that that land will remain in forestry?
No. Depending, they could either sell that land or they could just be removing timber from that land on the various facilities. Gotcha, head there. Moving next to the Department of Agriculture, there is a proposal in this agency as well that you've seen previously to increase the $40 per non-restaurant establishment food inspection fee to a variable fee based on the size of the enterprise. So it would range from $40 for facilities under 1,000 square feet up to $375 annually for establishments over 10,000 square feet. Some other reductions you'll see, half of the farmland preservation funding was removed in the first year and a 75% reduction in the second year. There was a reduction of $220,000 each year to the APHID program and the elimination of 1 new position that was provided for that. You all had doubled the size of the grants under that program last session. There's the elimination of state support for the federally funded coyote and black vulture control program. Again, this is a reduction you've seen a number of times. The General Assembly has historically restored. They also eliminate all the balances in the Beehive Grant Fund and do not provide any funding for it in the second year. Lastly, they eliminate funding that had been provided for specialty crop commercialization, and they take some reductions against their domestic and international marketing in both years of the biennium. Again, this was an item we provided $425,000 increases for that last year, so this is removing part of the new money they received, but not all. In the area of natural resources, the reductions are a bit smaller, just over 1% the first year, and 6.4 the second year. The largest savings are related to reducing funding for land preservation activities. And a number of the smaller reductions you'll see across these agencies, they offset by supplanting with some existing non-general fund balances and some fee increases. There are no reductions proposed for the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries of any variety. At DCR, you might recall that last session, the General Assembly had included language prohibiting the department from acquiring parklands without your express approval. During the veto session, the governor had proposed removing and amending that language. That was rejected then. This again would allow for the acceptance of lands without the General Assembly approval, and separately there's funding in capital outlay to acquire lands both for natural area preserves and for state parks. There's no new funding this year for ag BMPs because there was no surplus, and there was no proposal made in the budget to make any use of the WQIF reserve fund that the General Assembly has established to sometimes address years in which there's no funding for that. In terms of reductions at DCR, the October reductions were just over $1 million. They eliminated a one-time grant that had been provided for the Swift Creek Bike Trail, and they have eliminated 4 positions in environmental education. And at 18, the reductions come from reducing the assumed $8 million appropriation for the Virginia Land Conservation Fund to $4.5 million. At DEQ, the proposed reductions total $2.6 million, and they are all offset by the use of some dedicated non-general fund balances they have at the agencies. There would be reductions or use of $1 million from the Vehicle Emissions Inspections Fund and $1.6 million from the Waste Hire Fund. As part of the October plan, they also reverted some other balances in the Waste Hire Fund. In terms of language amendments, there is the elimination of language that had been included a couple of years ago, prioritizing the use of nutrient credit offsets for animal waste and energy projects. At the other natural resources agencies, at the Marine Resources Commission, there's some reductions of just over $1 million over the biennium, which are offset by some special fund increases in the second year. There's a proposal to save $214,000 to eliminate the saltwater sport fishing tournament. They also assume additional non-general fund revenues from increases in commercial fishing license and equipment fees. You all have allowed them under code. The commission is the entity that approves those increases. The commission did increase them at their December meeting, but delayed implementation of the increases until next December, because a couple of years ago, when they made an increase on the recreational side, the General Assembly chose to roll that fee back after it had already been approved.
So I'm thinking there should be some language introduced maybe to deal with that potentially. See, I'm sorry.
At Historic Resources, the entirety of their reduction came against the Battlefield Preservations program. The only new spending was just under $35,000 to add historical African American graves and cemeteries to the